So for those who don't know me, my name is Amy Castro. I'm co-founder of the Center for Guaranteed Income Research at the University of Pennsylvania. And along with my co-PI, Dr. West, we're running a number of guaranteed income experiments in the United States, kind of a lot of them at this point in time. And so what I'm going to talk about today is this concept of deservedness and the degree to which it is reflected amongst recipients of guaranteed income and potential recipients of a guaranteed income. Reason being, to your wonderful presentation prior to mine, thank you for like front loading and talking about narrative, is that if we don't sort of address the schemas that are potentially blocking us from sort of instituting universal basic income or a basic income, we're going to migrate kind of these deservedness narratives off of the welfare state. Okay, I'm speaking specifically about the United States in this case. All these social constructions around who's deserving, who is undeserving, and we're going to project them onto basic income, and we're going to replicate pre-existing narratives of inequality. And so on the one hand, I want to believe that we have this utopic, perfect vision for the future, right? I also know that the ways in which we have set up society create these narratives that are both internalized and projected. And this is one of the things that we're tracking across all of our different sites. So I'm going to start out with a nod to Keynes, because I think it's important. So going all the way back to 1933, Keynes says, I'm going to paraphrase this since it's not on the screen, that, excuse me, oh, look at you. Go ahead. Where'd you come from? Great job. What's your name?
Lisa, I was.
Thank you, Lisa.
I was in charge of this room, but was sent to another room. Sorry.
No problem.
Which
You're okay. You're good.
yeah.
You're good.
This one?
Yeah. So I'm just gonna, yeah, no problem. Y'all, this is just funny. I'm not this kind of scientist, the kind that does technology. You had the word tech on your screen a lot in the last PowerPoint. My expectations were higher. Apologies. Thank you so much, Lisa. I really appreciate it. So to take a starting point from Keynes, we think back to the New Deal era in the United States. And the reason that I'm choosing this is really specific, is that when we look back at, or excuse me, if I take any social problem that we have right now in the United States, I can trace it back to many things. But as far as policy windows go, you can trace it back to the New Deal, as that the groups of people that we locked out of upward mobility, the groups of people that we locked out of public benefits are the same groups of people who experience accumulated disadvantage over time. And so when we think about that as a frame, it guides a little bit about how we can think in a more 360-degree way about basic income, the things that may be preventing us from getting it into policy. So Keynes says, and I won't read the whole quote for the sake of time, but he says, the whole conduct of life was made into a sort of parody of an accountant's nightmare. Instead of using their vastly increased material and technical resources to build a wonder city, the men of the 19th century built slums. And they thought it right advisable to build slums because slums on the test of private enterprise paid. Whereas the Wonder City would, they thought, have been an act of foolish extravagance. Moving forward, the same rule of self-destructive financial calculation governs every walk of life. We are capable of shutting off the sun and the stars because they do not pay a dividend. But once we allow ourselves, and this is the important piece, once we allow ourselves to be disobedient to the test of an accountant's profit, we've begun to change our civilization. This starting point really of internalizing this idea that capitalism is king and profit is king has so driven the way that we even think about implementing, at least in my country, guaranteed income pilots, that if we don't do the work of interrogating why those assumptions are there, we really run the risk of just replicating this over and over and over again. So to that end, this really is the context or the shell that the unconditional cash movement is sitting in right now, at least in North America. So when we think about late stage capitalism, I keep saying to my students, eventually we'll have a brief history of blank by whoever the next David Harvey is. But we don't have that yet. We don't even have language for the sort of cultural economic moment that we are living in. We're kind of grappling around the edges. I think some of your work might get us there. I'm excited to see what you do in the future. But we don't even have language for what it is that we're experiencing. But I know two things based on the work that we're doing with guaranteed income in the States. First is that when we think about this concept of financialization, right? So essentially the commodification of life, the things that used to be non-monetary, making money by manipulating money rather than actually producing goods and services that are tangible, that you can touch, right? So think about Silicon Valley going from beautiful innovation, creating technology that I can touch, that I can see, to then social engineering and profiting off of things like social media or cookies or third-party applications, right? That's an aspect of financialization. So when we think about financialization as it is embedded in late-stage capitalism, we know that it's characterized by three things: distance, so tremendous distance between financial actors; abstraction; and asymmetry, meaning that you're always kind of looking through a prism. You can't exactly see the whole thing. And so as we kind of continue to financialize out and out and out, what we are doing is creating tremendous distance in society. We're eroding meaning, we're eroding connection. And so the way I often like to talk about this or think about this is think about human contact. I'm obsessed with this idea of democratizing it, is that we're now think we can commodify human contact, turn it into an app and maybe make it more efficient, right? But we know that this process of financialization creates financialized subjects. It contributes to self-disciplining mechanisms, right? So think Foucault, basic panopticon. If we internalize this self-destructive financial logic that Keynes is talking about, we don't even need to be controlled because we're controlling ourselves on behalf of the economy. So that shell creates this illusion of possibility. So we love this narrative of capitalism in the United States. You can pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Is it any shock that Trump is again on stage for president, right? Somebody who's literally selling this false narrative of money is king and you can earn it, right? And in reality, what financialization is doing is it's providing an illusion of possibility from a sparse buffet of choices. You can have this stressful job, this situation of scarcity, or that situation of scarcity. You can be anything you want to be, children, at 65 hours a week. Forget about relationships and parenting, right? And then when we think about the welfare state, we also have this long history of shame, blame, and stigma being internalized and then also projected. Okay, so this is actually a slide from another presentation, but I want to highlight research question 2. In this particular study, what we were doing was asking this question: to what degree do potential recipients reflect these traditional narratives of deservedness? That, again, that backdrop is financialization, right? Of saying disciplined, financialized subject, right? To what degree do people hold on to that? While at the same time holding on to what we know from decades of social science in the US is that people tend to reflect these deservedness, stigma, shaming narratives, and they serve as a form of social control, and it keeps the system in place as is. So methodologically, we're working with a method called Big Qual. This is a depth and breadth method. We're not looking for generalizability in a quantitative sense, the way that you would traditionally think about it. Instead, we're talking about theoretical generalizability. And we're in this unique position where we had a number of pilots that were starting at the same time. Our database is very large. And so we thought, you know what? I think there's something that's shifting in American culture, and we have an opportunity to say something at scale, theoretically, because we're working in so many different places around the United States. So what we're working with is about 1,571 in this particular paper, survey responses. These are open-ended text boxes that fit alongside our scales, and then semi-structured interviews, which, how many are there? Let's find out. Nope, that doesn't help me. Mira, how many do we have? I don't know. In this paper, 200 interviews, 1.5 to 2.5 hours long. Okay, something to that effect. And we move through 3 phases. First, breadth, right? And this is recursive thematic mapping through content analysis on the open-ended narrative data. This is getting a scan of the entire data set. Then there's depth. So after you kind of get that scan, people think about it as a test pit from archaeology. If you're familiar, it's where do I need to look in this giant corpus of data? And then second, depth, taking a grounded theory method and going really deep based on what you're seeing in that thematic analysis component. Everything okay? Oh. Can you follow me around and fix my phone? Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And then the final stage is interpretive analysis. Okay, so what did we find? What we were looking at specifically here were to see when people were, before I'm jumping to findings, I didn't describe my research question, or my method adequately, I apologize. What we're working with here are 8 different guaranteed income sites across the United States. all of them, with the exception of Stockton, started at the peak of the pandemic. Okay, and so we're looking at a really unique slice of cultural history. If you're not familiar with our experiments, the way that they work, these are randomized controlled trials. If you want to know the sort of nerdy aspects of that, you can talk to our data scientist, Nidhi, who's right there. Raise your hand, Nidhi. But one of the things that we do is that those open-ended text boxes, those occur on the baseline survey, which means we're getting a snapshot of people's perspectives before they know if they are randomized into treatment, control, or nothing. And because we're using the same instrument across 38 experiments with 20,000 people, we have a really, really big N, which means we've got a really unique chance to say, what is it? How are people thinking about the ways in which guaranteed income may function or not function in the United States context? Then the second point of data collection are the semi-structured interviews, and those are occurring at the midpoint of the pilot or at the conclusion of the pilot, 6 months after the money ends. So we're actually able to trace these narratives to the degree, do they shift, do they not, from baseline to end line? And then crucially, most important here, is that our first point of data collection was in 2019 in Stockton, which was before the pandemic. So we're also able to say, do these narratives, did they happen because of the pandemic, or was there something taking place bigger than that prior to that? Turns out there was. So we analyzed these particular responses. We found 4 big categories. And there you can see Ronald Reagan unveiling his wonderful myth of the welfare queen, which is really the thing that in our culture is lying behind so many of these schemas. First, when we asked people, how do you think people would spend a guaranteed income or a basic income or unconditional cash? What would happen if you provided? What do you think other people would do? Now, opposite of what we typically get with our stigma and shame narratives, people presumed that folks would spend the money rationally. They presumed that people would spend the money either on themselves to sort of generate alternative pathways for economic mobility, or that they would spend the money on behalf of kids. This is the exact opposite of the myth of the welfare queen, which presumes that when people are receiving a social benefit, they're going to quit their jobs en masse. Like, how many times do we have to debunk that? Like, a lot. Like, can I stop running guaranteed income studies now? They assume that, or they assume it'll be spent on vice goods. Here, what we saw in these particular pilots, and again, this is treatment and control before people knew whether they were in the experiment or not, they presumed that people would spend it rationally. Second, reclaiming time and connection from capitalism. Third, a presumed collective struggle. And then finally, fractured deservedness narratives. Okay, so first, reclaiming time and connection from capitalism. We saw this in 3 specific ways. So if we think back to Carol Stack, 1974, this enduring question of how is it that the poor get by? If people are that strained, how are they surviving underneath the weight of capitalism? And the answer has always been all our kin, right? We get by forming collective, communities of mutual aid that push against the structural weight of vulnerability. But that can't absorb austerity forever. It's just literally impossible, right? Like the family can't just keep absorbing and absorbing and absorbing the failures of the market, the failures of the state. People's bodies literally break down, and we're seeing that happen. And what we saw in these particular findings was that people presumed that folks needed to reclaim their time and connection from capitalism, which is rather extraordinary. This really is a shift. If you know the deservedness literature in the United States, this is a 180-degree turn from the way that we've been talking about poverty and living paycheck to paycheck for easily 40 years. Second, we see that deservedness frame is really codified into the family unit, is that we say to sort of one group of economic actors, we're going to set up society in such a way that you can leverage it to fit our idealized notion of who you ought to be. But then for these other folks, we're going to have a different set of rules. And that different set of rules is the thing that has always guided their responses in these types of studies, but now it seems to be flipping in the other direction. And so you can see here this quote from a participant who said, I think that most Americans work too much and they don't have enough time to see the family. Second category of findings here, actually third, according to the original list, is we're starting to see these fractured deservedness narratives. So this participant put it really well, who said, we have this attitude in America that if you're not making it, it's your fault. I think what people just get wrong about living paycheck to paycheck is that it's their fault. It's not their fault. We really saw, as we kind of pushed in these interviews and also looking at that open-ended survey data, pushing on pushing on sort of asking the question, to what degree are these narratives starting to shift? And we saw that as we asked folks what they thought, they really resisted othering people. So if you're familiar with the Sacombe article, this classic, they think you ate much of nothing, which is about attitudes towards welfare stigmatization in the United States, people are very, very quick to say, my situation's different. I'm in poverty because something really bad happened to me. My landlord tricked me. My mom died. All these things happening. But all those other people out there, they are lazy. They are cheating the system. And they're just, I'm the exception to the rule. That's the way it's always been. Then right about the time of the Great Recession, that started a little bit to shift. And we see that reflected in our data around guaranteed income, where people are saying, I'm not going to answer that question. We hear this over and over again. Again, at this point, I'm only drawing on 200 narratives in this particular paper, but we've repeated 1,200 1.5 to 2.5 hour interviews with people all across the United States and hear the same thing over and over and over again. I don't want to blame other people for their situation of poverty. And it becomes this starting point for a shift in thinking and a starting point to pushing back and thinking about resistance. This is probably the most important finding. Reflected in responses, again, both treatment and control, baseline to end line, is this presumption of collective financial struggle. So, when we think about that frame of financialization and neoliberalism, what does it do? It is focused on the individual. Me, 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 me. I'm going to pull myself up by my bootstraps. You need to do this. You are relying on me, on my tax dollars. That's the narrative frame. And pushing against that, again, think about Stack. What Carol Stack was accurately pointing out was saying, we are about community, we are about connection. And if we want to have a more collective approach to a social contract or the economy, we have to get ourselves there if we're ever going to imagine a place, at least in my culture, where we're saying we are going to implement something like a basic income, which is about the type of society they want to construct. I don't think I have to say that to this crowd because y'all are kind of on my team. Thanks, that's great. But one of the things that was really interesting was that unlike the Sacombe data, unlike the prior work that's been done, we really saw when we're speaking with folks, they presume that other people are experiencing structural injustice. So rather than saying, I'm the exception to the rule, something really awful befell me, but everybody else who's also on benefits, they're just lazy and cheating the system. That's now flipped in the other direction. You can see this reflected in one quote from our participant. This is somebody from Santa Fe, New Mexico, who said, we're a community of people. We're human beings, we're not an economy. Hearing comments like that over and over and over again illustrates that there's this pathway to connection that is opened up when we think about unconditional cash, and it can be the starting point for resistance. So rather than saying, I'm in this position by accident, but everybody else is there out of laziness, what we're starting to see is that there is something fundamentally different about receiving unconditional cash outside of waged labor, outside of capitalism, that is telling people that they matter and is making them feel more connected to humanity. So I know that sounds a little squishy and maybe a little pie in the sky, but one of the things that we'll be releasing, I'll give you a small teaser that we're super excited about throughout the fall, as we've been using different measures around things like self-transcendence, community, belonging. To what degree do you see yourself reflected in others? There are actually scales for this. We did the qualitative analysis first to actually see, does that make sense to chase that rabbit trail? Turns out, yes, is that we know at this point at scale across these 8 sites and the other ones that we're working on, that there is something about receiving unconditional cash over time, meaning it has to be recurring, not lump sum, that starts to see people start to see themselves as more connected to society, not more divided. I just want to close with this last quote here. There's a whole bunch there. There's this idea of kind of mechanisms of resistance, which I won't go into right now, but I just want to end with this quote at the very end, which someone's saying, the GI showed me what I'm worth. As that there was something about I'm receiving cash. It's not because I'm performing for capitalism. It's not because I'm performing along sort of this self-destructive financial logic. I matter because I'm human. That's a really different frame. So thank you so much. I appreciate your patience with my lack of technology skills because they're pretty bad.